in dialogue. He's the founder of his own, the Global Dialogue Institute, the World Wisdom Council. This man is just always comes forward with his heart and has that tremendous enthusiasm and energy that we know will just get us all revved up and feeling great and hopeful and optimistic for the future. So let's give a warm welcome for Ashok Gangadine.
Thanks. Thank you, Glenn. Is this working? Good. Thank you very much. I'm glad you don't write your improv introductions. I was just settling in to listen and enjoy this for the afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. And this is the dialogue last night and this morning was very moving. And I always learn so much from these sacred circles. It really got me thinking. And I try to always improvise my remarks in the spirit of that dialogue. So please consider this a continuation of the dialogue, because as I listen to the dialogue and the main fundamental questions that we're looking at, the question of oil and water as profound metaphors for alterity, diversity, otherness, polarity of all kinds, not just oil and water in themselves as their symbols around the globe in the economy and ecology, but in terms of the divisions between cultures, ways of knowing, ways of being, male and female, it abounds in every direction. And I think the idea that was posed, which to me is central, is there a deep, primal, primordial language? Can we tap the deep grammar? Is there a deep grammar that's original language in which we have original thought? What would that look like? And really, for my 40 years as a philosopher, teacher, that's been my preoccupation. In my early years, I was trained as a logician in the Western logic. And I should step back a bit and say, to preface what I've just said, because in terms of the conversation last night and this morning, it really got me thinking more deeply about oil and water in ways I hadn't before. And I started reflecting on my name. And I'm thinking of my tribal origins in northern India. My family originated in India. That's my native indigenous origin. But I was born in the West Indies, in Trinidad. And I grew up in Trinidad, Jamaica, New York. And then my family settled in Arizona. And so I became an East-West Indian when I settled out there. And my whole life has been a quest for clarity of my identity because when I first arrived as a boy, there was a kind of ignorance of what does it mean to be Indian in New York City. And I would say that I'm Indian, and they would start to make all kinds of signs of Native American Indian. You know, kind of make signs because they watch Lone Ranger and Tonto and things. That was the mentality. When I say, no, I'm not a Native American Indian, they would then do some other kind of dance to indicate the snake and the serpent of India. And that was the options I had. And I was thinking of my name, which really goes back to water, because Ganga, as you know, is the sacred river of India, the Ganges. And my name, literally, Gangadine, means devotee of Ganga, one who follows the Ganga. And the sacred waters flow out of the hair of Shiva, which is an incarnation of Brahman, which comes from Om. So the sacred river flows right out of the primordial word of Om. And my name also has become popularized through Rudyard Kipling, and as I grew up as a boy, and whenever we heard Gangadine, they say, oh, Gangadine, I heard of you. Rudyard Kipling wrote about you. You're a better man than I am, Gangadine. And as you know, he was a water boy. So that I have multiple roots of water. So I'll try to be a water boy today and bring some water from the Ganges, and hope we can really address this question of original language. Because in my journey in the West, I didn't go back to India until I arrived at Haverford College, where I've been teaching for 40 years, in terms of this fundamental quest for logic as the science of consciousness, thought, and language. And when I went to India, it really blew me away when I encountered Indian thought for the first time. It was in my family. We were raised as a Hindu, but also sent to Christian school, so I was always kind of bicultural and mixed up about who I am and where I belong. So my life has always been one of a challenge of bridging for myself. Who am I? What is my world? So it's no accident in a way that my whole career has been trying to understand how do we move across worlds and between worlds. That's almost the title of one of my books. Between Worlds, The Emergence of Global Reason. And a companion volume, Meditative Reason Toward Universal Grammar, this grammar we're speaking of, primordial language. And so all of my training in the West as a young logician, studying the logic that shaped the European mind, the logic of Aristotle, that literally, as you know, logic is a science of consciousness, thought, and language. It's a primal science for the Greek logos. Because logic, if you can understand the laws of thought, you understand the deep structure and the DNA for all that you can think in every aspect of your life. So Aristotle, Plato, Socrates knew that if you could have the laws of thought and the dynamics of thought, you have the DNA structure for all culture. So I was gravitating towards logic because I wanted to understand those dynamics of thought. So I'm going to really do some PowerPoints. This pad here, I hope you can see on both sides. This is really a kind of attempt to do a live PowerPoint to visualize in a meditation what to me is the fundamental challenge for humanity now and has been for millennia, which is the place of language that most of us have been impaled in deeply, preconsciously, is a place that has been found problematic by all of our great wisdom teachers, East, West, North, and South. And I'm going to draw and try to, I'll do it in a sequence of slides, so to speak. So let me start generically by giving a sense of where I'd like to go and how, for me, it speaks to the deep concerns we're looking at this morning about original thought, original language. Is there a primal language of nature, of spirit, that can help us get out of our deep crises today? So I'm going to draw a place, two dimensions, a space here that will be, for me, the deep language of original thought that all of our great cultures and traditions have been seeking and questing and gravitating towards for millennia and attempting to develop the language for. And I'm going to draw a space here. I'll put a line there. It's not an innocent line. It's a very fundamental line to separate a space where most of us grow up and live and never get out of. And I'll put a kind of a box, a screen of consciousness. And I'm not even going to put the I yet, the spectator, the thinker, where the thinker is located with respect to that. But what I'm going to suggest, all of my life and training has been in this space. And philosophers, logicians, Aristotle calls this, to think is to predicate. The thought space, the screen of awareness. Think of this box, or the suggestion of this box, as a space in which our experience shows up. All phenomena, internal and external, is showing up on the screen. And I am the witness thinker. I am the subject who is thinking. I'm the user of language. I am the knower. But all of the information is here. And logicians wanted to know, what is the nature of thought? And the deep breakthrough in Greek logos, logos, by the way, for the Greek means speech, thought, mind, word. It's a rich word. All of that, reason. Science, accounting, all of that. So it was a breakthrough to see that whatever the linguistic system on the planet, you could speak Swahili, German, Greek, Hebrew, whatever, Lakota, whatever the language, in the linguistic sense, there's a deep structure, it has a logic, and the logic picks out the dynamics for any language. And it's a language of predication. It's a place in which we have subjects and predicates and we unite them. Whatever the linguistic structure, above that, the logical structure is a deep structure. That's where you get the DNA. So to think is to predicate, and to predicate is to join subjects and predicates as pieces of information, and you build your world here and your whole world. So if you say, I'm hungry, I'm cold, that's going here too. I am cold. Rain is falling. Whatever it is, the information here, and worldviews are formed here. Nevertheless, if we could step back from any particular worldview that we have, and I'm going to get back to this. This is, again, still a preliminary kind of pronouncement of what I'd like to show on the power slide to organize the thinking, is that our great traditions, if you can get out of the box of, say, the European tradition of philosophy that I was trained in, as I began to go east and get into Hindu thought and Buddhist thought and Chinese thought and then African thought and back to Lakota and so forth, and study how do worlds shift? What are the different mental ecologies that show up in the space of thought? And how do we move across them? Because one mental ecology, one worldview, organizes our predication structure. What you can think and say in one language, you can't even think or say in another. So they shift the lenses of cultures profoundly. Here in disciplines, they're all shifting in a kaleidoscopic diversity of different lenses that the self brings with it. So if you could step back from those more localized dialects and look at the global spectrum, it's an incredible, remarkable pattern that emerges. Because deep in the Chinese grammar, in ancient indigenous Chinese wisdom, it of course, as you know, speaks of the Tao. And the first message of the Tao Te Ching is that the Tao that is named is not the Tao. Recognizing the danger zone of trying to use ordinary modes of predication and thinking, this kind of calculus, this level of thinking and languaging violates the Tao. So the opening mantra or axiom of Tao Te Ching is the Tao, the fundamental infinite name, the word, the infinite word field, the sacred Tao that is named is not the Tao. And it goes on from there to show the dangers of getting impaled in this place of language and living all your life here and not crossing into the place of the Tao. If you go into the Hindu ancient seers that goes back in the deep Vedic traditions thousands of years, well before the Bhagavad Gita is written, you find the focus on Om as this infinite sacred symbol that is the place of the infinite word and the origin of all reality that manifests as Brahman and further manifests as Vishnu and Shiva and Krishna, and the whole cosmology comes out of Om, and you begin to see how the whole world is coming out of this one fundamental, mysterious, sacred symbol, Om. And if you read the Bhagavad Gita, what you find again is this parallel, because if you've read the Bhagavad Gita, you know it's part of the great epic, the Mahabharata, a great story. And it begins in a very poignant and compassionate and heart-rending way, because Arjuna is this great warrior. He's a war hero. And he's on the battlefield fighting this intertribal war, a fratricidal war with his own family. And he's a war hero, and they're fighting for the kingdom. The good guys against the bad. It's clear that one side sees itself as righteous and the other. And he looks across the battlefield, all the banners are waving, the conch shells are going, and it's time to charge. Krishna is his charioteer. Of course, Krishna is the voice of Om, who happens to be there with him to help lead him into battle. And Arjuna looks across the battlefield and sees his own uncle and his cousins and his nephew, and he says, oh my God, something pierces him. Something from a high place pierces him here. And he has a breakdown on the battlefield. And he says, my God, Krishna, I can't kill my own people. What do I need kingdom and wealth or any of those things if it's at the price of the spilling of the blood of my own people? That can't be right. So that crisis, when the ego splits, I use the word ego, but we'll see that this is a place of the ego person, the human being who is in the ego lens, the ego mind, processing information and making his or her world there. There's always going to be fractures, breakdowns, violence in this space. And it's going to crack, and your life is going to implode at some point, and then spiritual inquiry begins. That's how the Gita begins. And Krishna knows what's going on, and he just waits, and Arjuna turns to him, Krishna, he drops his weapon. He said, I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. If I kill my own people, I can't live with myself. I cannot enjoy kingdom. And I know if I drop my weapon and don't enter, I would be completely disgraced and dishonest, and my reputation is over. Either way, I'm done. So he drops his weapon, his life cracks, he says, Krishna, help me. And that's when the dialogue begins, a deep dialogue where Krishna, the voice of Om, speaking this language, not this language, because Krishna understands that Arjuna has finally arrived at the point where every ego person must be to recognize the implosion and the unsustainability of ego mental mind, and using language as an objectified way of information processing and self-making and world-making. So the therapy begins where Krishna first teaches him, pay attention to the logic of your language. You don't even understand your language. He teaches him in chapter 1 and 2, quickly, a quick course, learn your logic. Enough of that, he says. Now let's get serious. Let's do yoga, because that's the only way you're going to get out of this trap, and let's move into this space. And step by step, meditation by meditation, Krishna helps him recognize, to come to the reality that he has an ego lens That's a software for the mind that's processing information in a certain way that will always lead to breakdown, polarity, alienation, fragmentation, duality, by its very nature. And most of us never know that. And that's the first lesson in the spiritual journey, to recognize that you have a lens that's creating all of this world that's showing up that's unsustainable. And to enter into this difficult journey of crossing into to find yourself, not the I that you are here, but the I am that you are here. And to speak this language, to learn literacy in the grammar of Om is a whole journey of Hindu wisdom, indigenous wisdom. And it's a profound movement. How do you let go of the ego lens and the ego infrastructure? We said here in the circle that the key to dialogue, real dialogue, not ego-log, but dialogue, meeting the other, is suspending your tacit infrastructure. It's not just you want to wipe this story out and give another one. That's been going on for millennia. When Einstein removed the Newton story and brings in an alternative one, he changed the infrastructure. When Ptolemy was replaced by the Copernicus, it's a different structure. That's been going on all. You can wipe out one story and put another one. Materialism, idealism, dualism, pluralism, all of these ideologies are wiping out one another from their different sets of beliefs. Because a belief is a predication that you affirm or deny. This is where you hold your beliefs and ideologies. And your worldviews are going on here. So you can have multiple worldviews with different lenses that we can try on. You could have the Christian worldview. You could have the Buddhist worldview, the Hindu, whatever your worldview. If you're egoing it, you'll process it in the space, and you'll have all kinds of worlds, and those worlds are going to be broken, and there's going to be no real dialogue. There will be monologue, ego-log. It ain't dialogue. So to cross into the space where there's interconnectivity, which is the title of my talk, but I write interconnectivity with a certain marker, and that's what I'm leading up to. Because as my journey into these different grammars across the planet continued for 2 or more decades, I began to see the profound pattern of there's a deep language here that all of our great traditions were trying to educate us in the literacy of this grammar. We didn't even have a common name for it, and yet our life and death turns on this. And the question is, why, if we've had this wisdom, indigenous wisdom, for centuries and millennia, our culture is still stuck in this old technology of ego mental minding, which is taking us down off the cliff? That's a big question to look at. Why is it so recalcitrant and so deeply entrenched and has led us to this precipice now? So what I'd like to do is that just quick flash forward, not only Om, I've just hinted at the language of Krishna speaking the Om language to Arjuna and educating him in the manual of how do you retool your mind. And of course, it's a radical move because in a way, that's to die for. I'm not kidding, because one way or the other, you've got to shed your ego lens. You've got to suspend your infrastructure, not just in the particular story or stories, because you can see that a typical American citizen can have 5 or 6 different stories, to say the least, of different worldviews that you're trying to live with at the same time. I'll get back to that later. But there's something more profound, and that is the method in which I'm using the mind. And I think when Alan here spoke of the software that we've had for 3 million years, the technology that people have had on this planet of processing information. Language is the ultimate technology. Not just fire, but all technologies come from how we use our mind. And the ultimate technology is minding. And we've had a certain kind of ego mental structure in our journey as human beings, and this has held us captive. It's extremely difficult to break the cycle and circles and the energy field of the ego mental space. So in a way, Krishna says, and the journey of yoga is to surrender the ego in some profound step back. That's what it means to let go of your infrastructure, let go of the ego technology and egoing yourself, because what you do is you make yourself into a subject of predication. And that gives you your ID. And that is called karma. And the whole point of life is to shed your karma and let it go and go into a deeper place where you find your place and yourself in connectivity, interconnectivity in the calculus of Om. That's extremely difficult to do. It requires great discipline in that rite of passage from one to the other. So in a way, you do have to die to the ego to cross over into this space. And this line represents a fall from connectivity into the calculus of disconnectivity and objectification, where this is the object and this is the subject who's thinking, and this line that separates the I from the not I sets in motion, we'll see, I'll come back to this again. I still am doing the preliminary setup of the PowerPoint. And so I'm giving you points that I'll come back and revisit to ask, what is it about this ego minding that is so deeply entrenched, that holds us captive, that breaks our world into fragments and breaks us from ourself? So that when you when you play this calculus game, whatever your worldview may be, you are cutting yourself, and this cut is important. It's been called various things by different traditions. The Judeo-Christian tradition would call it sin. The sin cut is where you separate from connectivity into a fall of disconnectivity. And when you are implanted in this place, you are living in some primal ontological sin or separation from connectivity. The question then becomes, how does one, in this place, retrieve and come back into deep connectivity? And that is a rite of passage. If you go into Buddha's language, he was raised as a Hindu prince, but he rejected and went on his own in a deep inquiry. Because the language of Atman and Om could easily be processed here too. If you're not careful, we tend to download this speech here. And Buddha saw that to be trapped here is deadly. That's his great breakthrough. So when Buddha awakened 2,500 years ago in this deep life and death experiment he went into, he came out with 4 noble truths, which are in a way global truths. Very simple formulas for the masses. Existence is suffering. It has a cause. The cause is clinging to that ego identity self. We have a choice. That's the third one. We don't have the ego. It's a vice. It's an addiction. It's a pattern of thinking to which we are addicted. And most of us don't realize we have a choice in the mental program we're using in processing it. That's the third noble truth. We have a choice. And the fourth noble truth, we can rehabilitate, and that's the word, we can rehabilitate the patterns of our consciousness into the place where everything is interconnected. The place of shunyata, which is the Buddhist name. In the Sanskrit, shunya is zero, and shunyata is zero-like or zero-ness. So reality cannot be tainted with predication words, these words. It is empty of this. But it's filled and overflowing with interconnectivity. So the fabric of reality is a boundless, infinite, dynamic field of ever-deepening connectivity where all things co-arise. That's the key word in the Buddhist language, co-arising. And the Sanskrit is pratitya samutpada. There are no separate things. Whatever is arises dynamically, energetically, in connection with everything else. It's a holistic, integral space. And this is the Dharma. This is the universal law. This is the place of compassion. So that to retool the mind from the habits of heart and mind of egoing, to break the circuits, which is samsara, to cross into the place of connectivity and co-arising, is the way one enters out of the samsara into the nirvana, the joy, the fulfillment of one's potential in becoming a full mature human being with a new pattern of mind. So when your mind is retooled in the virtue rather than the vice of being one with the law and flowing with the law. So there's a way to use your mind where it is a co-arising mind, where you're not separated from the other, but you're woven into the other in every moment. That's a dynamic language. And it took the Buddhist tradition centuries to break out of here, because the early Buddhist teachers, despite Buddha's teaching, kept presenting Buddha's teaching here. Because Buddha is saying, forget the Atman, because of the entrapment of thinking in a substance way. So Buddha called it anatta, no self. The philosophy or teaching of Buddha was not a theory. It was not another story. It was a therapy of liberating oneself from all of these ideologies and stories and worldviews. He said all views are empty. They're dogmas, they're belief systems. They entrap you in the place of predication. So the place for liberation is to let those go and enter into deep connectivity. And I could go on, but I'm trying to give you a sense of a pattern of different traditions. And I like to show East and West, that's been really the move, that the quest for the first, that there's something first and fundamental that to which the human consciousness inexorably gravitates by whatever name you call it. So if you switch for a moment from the Eastern traditions into the Western, and certainly we're all thinking about indigenous ways of trying to get to this fundamental first spirit or infinite, whatever name, the Judaic tradition is born here in terms of Yahweh. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one. The call of Yahweh as the infinite word, the infinite spirit, is also another name and language for this. You might think of now, if you come back, and this is what happened in my life, because I was trained here and this is all I knew. Forget reference to this, because just bring all of this down here, because my training in logic, which spanned logic for 2,500 years, showed that Aristotle and the early Greeks presented one logical structure. You know, the syllogism, S is P, S is not P, and so forth, as the laws of thought that shaped the European mind and culture all the way through past Descartes into Kant. And it was only when Gottlieb Frege, in 1879, wrote this incredible new language, a concept script, Begriffsschrift, he calls it. And Bertrand Russell discovers it and says, oh my God, we finally found the calculus. It was a world-changing moment when Bertrand Russell brought it back to England and made it available to the English-speaking world. And the student Wittgenstein came from Germany to study with him at Cambridge, and Alfred North Whitehead joined with Bertrand Russell in the new instrument that was discovered of mathematical logic. And I was trained in that logic as well. And that mathematical logic opened up the whole new computer age. It was the first time it was thought we finally got logic. Aristotle was baby logic. It was a good beginning, but it wasn't strong enough as a calculus. We finally found the universal calculus. And that spawned the analytical revolution in modern philosophy. It swept philosophy. That if you want to be a philosopher, you've got to know the mathematical logic and think in that logic, because then you'll think clearly. And that was a revolution of the Anglo-American philosophy. And I was trained in both those logics, and my doctoral dissertation when I was at Brandeis was to say and ask, is the mathematical logic the ultimate logic of human consciousness? And should we dismiss the classical logic of Aristotle that shaped the whole European imagination, which is what these new philosophers were suggesting? They just wanted to throw it out as horse and buggy, as it was a Ptolemaic astronomy, has been completely displaced. And as I studied the two logical paradigms, I realized you couldn't do that. The modern logic was a breakthrough. But the classical logic had a point and saw things that the modern logic couldn't see. So what I discovered in my doctoral dissertation is that there were two fundamental lenses that repelled one another in the space of predication. Two models of predication that I couldn't put together. And they rejected each other. And one dismissed the other. So my question when I arrived at Brandeis as a young philosopher is, if reason is coherence and connectivity and where things make sense, and we need to understand how oil and water how do we cross worlds? If logic is split at its core, then we're in deep trouble because we don't have a common rational instrument. Rationality itself is polarized and split. So I was in crisis when I arrived at Haverford, and the main question in my mind was that oil and water question. How do we cross worlds? If I'm raised in the Christian world, can I truly understand the Hindu world? Can I go into the Buddhist mind? And it was clear that that was one of the main questions that we have to face. And that all of my writings for 40 years has been on that. And I'd like to give you a quick sense of how this evolved for me. Because it was when I went to India in 1971 for the first time, not realizing I wasn't paying attention to Indian philosophy, even though I knew it was there, or Indian logic. I was going there to go back to roots and try to seek my identity. Was I Indian? Was I American? American Indian? What? You know. And I was there to just have a cultural encounter, studying the Sanskrit. I went to study tabla and sitar. This is a time when Ravi Shankar and the Beatles are here, going with the sitar, and I was just going back to learn the sitar and so forth. And I went to the university lecturing on the problem of logic, and they were stunned to see it because they were all buying into Russell. And when I pointed out the polarity in logic, it was an eye-opener for them. And I started studying at that point for the first time Indian philosophy. And when I read the Bhagavad Gita and I saw that Krishna was saying, pay attention to where you are, that if you think in this way, and the whole philosophy of yoga, if you've read Patanjali, The opening lines of this great sutra, 2,000 years ago, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, is Yogas Chittam Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is a silencing of predication. And that struck me when I saw that these philosophers and teachers of the Indian tradition were saying, you can be in the ego predication place, and it's always going to be polarized and split. And there's a place and a way to go through meditative technology into the place of a unified, coherent connectivity where you find your human maturation. When that door opened up, it completely shifted my whole career, because when I came back to Haverford after 1 year of encountering Buddha's journey and the whole teaching of Vedanta, that showed for the first time that, hey, I didn't even realize I was in this space. Or where was I as a thinker? All of my education and culture was here. So it was traumatic, but also exciting, because as now I begin to see why I hit this deep polarization. It may have had to do with the fact that I was using an ego-mental instrument, and there is an alternative. And that started me in a 35-year journey to try and ask, what's going on here? So as this journey continued, the question I asked as a young philosopher, is there a fundamental logic deeper than this, in which we can find genuine coherence and connectivity and a holistic connecting of the dots to overcome the brokenness and the polarity that was increasingly showing up in this place? And as I began to teach the text from the East, I was a scandal at the university, because how could me, Ashok, an analytic logician, that is, in terms of that tradition, begin to teach Indian philosophy as if it were really philosophy? It was regarded as, mysterious, non-philosophy, not to be taken seriously. So it really created a political situation for me as I started to teach the students Indian philosophy. But when I started teaching it, of course, I knew nothing about this space. I taught it here. For the first year or two, I tried to say, let's figure out what Krishna is saying in the Gita, because this is the only place of language that I was aware of, the only language I knew. I didn't know there was another space yet. So I was trying to say, well, what is Krishna saying? What is Buddha's teaching? What are the Four Noble Truths? And putting it here. And I very quickly realized I'm undermining the text and undermining my students. How can I be putting that teaching into this space when these teachers and texts are saying, don't get stuck in this space? That the essence of the encounter with the text and the teaching is to move into a place of experiencing the connectivity. So I was in a crisis as an educator, and I realized to be authentic, I had to find an alternative way of pedagogy, to reinvent teaching and pedagogy, to authentically help students experimentally step out of this space, problematize it, become critical of it, and experimentally go with the text to see what would it mean for mind to go into the place of meditative, holistic interconnectivity. It took me at least another decade to see that to help the students, because we were struggling, I hadn't opened up the space yet, that look, we need to mark when we are in this mind program, when we are ego-minding, any word we speak, whatever our worldview, let's put it in a marker. So I use single strokes, almost like ego-mental quotes, to mark when you're in this space. And when you're listening to a voice or trying to go into this, I use double parentheses, almost like the infinite space, to mark when language is here. So any word uttered in the ego-mental space could then be moved into this space of connectivity where the logic expands tremendously deeply. Because I began to see in this deep logic, and it took me another decade to get the name for it, because we had all of these competing names: Tao, Om, Shunyata, Allah, Yahweh, Christ, Nomo in Africa, the names of indigenous languages too also names that fundamental unifying force and infinite spirit, or whatever name you use. So I realized that with those divisions, there was still a profound logic here, a grammar, a deep grammar, and that to help to decode that would be ultimately important for us on the planet at this time, to bring oil and water together and find a way for our different broken worlds to find a meeting point. So that's what led me to experiment as a logician with what is this space, and let's mark them off. And this helps students enormously to see that when Krishna is speaking from the Om language to Arjuna, He's speaking from this double bracket space, this double parenthesis space, the Om logic, speaking to the ego logic, right? And that if Krishna only spoke this logic, he would have lost Arjuna here. So he's got to reach Arjuna where Arjuna lives. He's got to speak this logic, but also at the same time hold this space in order to help Arjuna cross over. Once you begin to see these two places, so this is really what I'm outlining. I want to elaborate in the remaining time I have. What are these two spaces? What is language like? What would it be like in this space? And I'm just going to mention that I began to see the importance of trying to find a name, a candidate to help us see that all of these great different traditions, East, West, North, and South, are pointing to this deep fundamental grammar, logic, syntax, whatever name you'd like to call it. And I propose the word logos sophia. I took the Greek word, logos, but also the sophia, because as a philosopher, philosophia is loving Sophia. So my profession as a philosopher is a lover of Sophia, and Sophia is wisdom. And the logos is reason, word, mind, thought. And so this primal name, if we're going to try and find a candidate, not that it's any fixed candidate, but I was looking for one as a logician, and the logic word, the logos word, the Sophia word, not in the old sense that's more male and masculine dominated, but one that was truly integrated and holistic, that had the full feminine power of the Sophia, immediately inscribed in that name, Logosophia. And in that Logosophia of this space, I was attempting to understand what happens to language when you cross from here into there. And for our conference, what I see, where I sit, that to talk about ecology and economy and community and connectivity and oil and water, all of these themes, that you can have those terms here too. So when you talk about economics, and as Glenn pointed out and several others pointed, oikos nomos, oikos logos, that when you go into this place, I'm suggesting, we find the place of original thought, original language, a primal script of nature, spirit, the universe. There's a primal script in this word space that cannot be broken in the way that language and script is broken here. So that in the original language space, so when you say, as John says in his God, in the beginning is the Word, and the Word was God, in that version, and the Word spoke. This Word is whole and integral and infinite and all-embracing and manifesting throughout the universe. So all the universe is a primal script of Logosophia. It is a logosphere. And every point in the logosphere touches every other point. It has a profound causal interconnectivity. So that if you imagine that nature is a script, it has a language. It speaks to us. And every word that we put in our human constructed languages, if we take it into this place, it has a profoundly altered meaning. If we take water, single bracket, and if we could do this and put water here, imagine how magnificent sacred water is. What a miracle it is to take water from here and put it there. That's sacred water. That water flows throughout the entire field. So when Thales suggests that all is water, he may not be speaking about ego water here. He may be touching the deepest water that flows throughout the entire field of Om, Yahweh, Shunyata, Allah, nature. Take oil and make it into sacred oil. What happens to money when it's egonomics and you put money here as divine energy and sacred energy? It becomes logonomics. So that in this place, if there's a place of logonomics, that any point in this space is a powerful, sacred point of interconnectivity. A tremendous power point. And each of us is such a place. Each of us is a power point in that space. So if I take this pen that we talk about, that we toss away, it's made of plastic, it is for writing, it is purple, whatever name we use, right? We treat it as an object here. We objectify it. We objectify it. But to take this pen and put it in that sacred space is nothing short of a miracle. I'm almost reluctant to do it. You know, to imagine what is the pen. Because when you put the pen in its logos space, so Sophia space, or Om space, or Shunyata space, whatever name, suddenly this becomes interconnected with the entire universe. And the information structure of the pen expresses the full Om power, to use that language. It has Om power. It has Yahweh power. So the pen is mightier than the sword. The pen speaks of all language and all script, all culture. All of this is inscribed in the pen. I'm so lucky to be holding this pen. I think I'll pass it around. We could all touch it. Imagine if we found this on Mars. If the probe picks this up and Houston is looking, suddenly what would happen is the most significant point in history. We found a pen on Mars. Or if we picked up a mosquito, suddenly you'll begin to see it with new eyes. And those eyes are suggesting the eyes of, my God, that encodes the entire information of all history and evolution. And so it is with us too. Because when you say I in the single bracket, whatever cultural lens you're using, you're making yourself into an object of predication. If I ask you, tell me about yourself, where you say, I was born in such and such, I come from this tribe, I'm American, I'm a citizen, I'm a male, I'm a father, and you give all your predication story, and most of us buy into that, I'm a bundle of predications. That's what it means to be a thing. And this teaching of interconnectivity never do that. And we know that indigenous wisdom sees we're not objects. We're sacred beings who are deeply interconnected in the boundless spirit, dynamically. This language is who we are. So that to say I am in this space is an incredible act of empowerment and liberation. But you can't say it from this ego lens. You can't use this mind program. Alan's point, I think, is a very important one. The question we're asking is, how deeply are we, wherever we are, and in our culture, using this technology to express even our deepest wisdom? If I'm a Christian here and I say Jesus is the way, Jesus saves, Jesus is the Logos made flesh, and I'm a believing Jesus here, I believe in Jesus as my Savior, for example. And I hear that there's Allah as the only true name. And that is a true name for God. Now, how do you dialogue between Jesus and the Mother? How would that dialogue go where this place of belief says that this is my truth and that is your truth? So this is the place in which, by its very nature, there cannot be genuine dialogue and the meeting of different worldviews. It has to go to the deeper logos. My brother, Surendra, who lived in Phoenix, became a fundamentalist Christian. And this was before I went to India. He was up on Camelback Mountain in Phoenix, and Jesus appeared to him. This was a campus crusade for Christ. And Jesus appeared to him. And I had to respect my brother because he was not just, he was just literally finding Jesus. And Jesus told him that Ashok would be saved. And just before I left for India in 1970, he came to the house. I was in Phoenix, and he said, Ashok, kneel with me and pray. Don't go to India. You're going to be lost. Your soul will be lost. I love you. Jesus loves you. You're going to be saved. Jesus told me that. Let's kneel and let's pray and accept Jesus as your Lord. And I'll tell you, he said it with such love and conviction. I looked in his eyes a long time. I didn't know what to say because I loved him. And then my heart told me, no, go to India. You have to go to India. There's not only one truth. An ultimate act of conscience for me. It took me years later to discover a Jesus, a very different Jesus. A Jesus here. And then I began to read the scriptures again. I obviously gave him Jesus. Right? When he told me, I just said, well, you've got Jesus. So I kind of walked away from Jesus because, Surendra had him and Jesus is the only way. So I went to India. But Jesus was also there for me. And years later, as I began to read the scriptures again and realized the script cannot be downloaded here. The double bracket Jesus, in fact, for me, was the essence of what Jesus was teaching. that the law has to be written in your heart. And when he was the Logos in the flesh, that he was speaking this language, the double bracket language, as the covenant that he was trying to bring forth, not the objectifying one. So that when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, that is literally the language of this Logos, Sophia. Because in this non-dual, holistic language, it's a dimensional shift in language. Language here is always representational. When you, the speaker, in this space, this is one space where the speaker is conscious, you use language here, which is your linguistic system, whatever it is, Swahili, Hebrew, whatever it is. You form your sentences, es regnet, il pleut, it is raining. You could express the same logic in different sentences. The sentences, if true, reaches out to the world, which is over here. So already there's a profound difference between the space of thinking and consciousness, the space of language, where you express your thoughts, which represent the world, and pictures it ostensibly. And if this all lines up, then you've got truth. Truth is a correspondence between the thinker's thoughts, the meaning, the sentences, and what they refer to out in the world. And if the pen is purple, and that's your thought, then that thought, the pen is purple. It's true. That's dualistic language. Non-dual language is of a different dimension because the thinker, the spoken, and what is spoken always meets in a PowerPoint. You cannot separate the speech from the speaker from the spoken. When you say, I am here, you're not using a pronoun referring to some object outside of the I. It is not a representational language, it is a performative, presentational language that declares itself forth by the very utterance. So to say I am in this space is a dimensional shift in the use of language. It's non-dual language. In this space then, the information gets broken down. I'm now almost moving from my setting up of the distinction more into the body of what I wanted to do now. So stay with me, please. What I've said so far was that it became very important for me in my journey into global wisdom to begin to see that there's a wide variety of different presentations of a deep language trying to get to what is primal and first. You begin to see that what is first, being infinite, can only be one, because if it is more than one, it's not infinite. So that the logic shows that they must turn on itself. There must be some primordial logic or primal language going on here. And despite the battles between Hinduism and Buddhism and Tao and Confucian and the many different traditions, there is still at core a fundamental grammar being played out that is holistic and integral and non-dual in its nature to express the infinite calculus. And the consensus is that all of these different traditions concur that if you're using this level of consciousness and language and thought and making yourself and your world here, it's always going to be an individual, personal, cultural disaster. And that there are systemic ways of crossing from this place into that place, and that is the human journey to becoming a whole human being. This is the place in which we're human. And yet cultures have continued to be stuck in this mind operating system, despite the access to the teachers here. So what happens to Jesus when Jesus begins to initiate this language? I am the way, I am the truth. And all of the crossings from one to the other, if you take the bread and break the bread and you make it into holy bread, this is my body, the body of Logos. And you take the wine and you lift, this is my blood. When the Logos speaks this language, the words shift profoundly in their meaning, from their dualistic meaning to their holistic power for every word. So to say I am is an incredible act. And comes at a great price of daring to step back from this space. And even when our great adventurous teachers have done so, they have gotten pulled back and in a way crucified. Because when Jesus was speaking this language and saying something obviously literally true, I and the Father are one. And you download it here into the logic of identity, A equals B, then you say, I am God. And you're finished. So to crucify God and crucify is to put Jesus here in the single brackets. Do you want Jesus in the box? Or do you want Jesus is the Logos made flesh. Do you want God in the box? You may say God Almighty, the greatest God, the infinite God, but if you're speaking it here, you've killed God. And that's why Nietzsche said, God is dead, and the Christians have killed him. Meaning by that, when you objectify God and try to finitize it in the control technology of ego objectification, you violate the infinite script. Scripture is here. It cannot be brought down here. And that's what we keep doing. So my dialogue shifted with my brother. 20 years later, I went back to him with this Jesus. And it was no longer a matter of Jesus or no Jesus, but which Jesus are you going to talk about? Let's talk Scripture. So a new dialogue opened up between this Jesus and that. That's another story. I don't want to go into that right now, but I just wanted to say enough. I'll give you a few examples to show if we were to think of this, and this is where I'd love to have help from the wealth of wisdom in this room, because I know many of you understand this language. And somehow if you could find the common technology to converge on it together, that we could bring it out more. And I'd love to learn from you, and I'm already learning so much. So I want to give some more examples in this messy picture. Or maybe I should make it a little clearer. Let me start over. Catch our breath. Because I didn't put something in that picture that might make a big difference. I'm now going to give examples of crossing from this language into that to make the contrast, to give us some tangible feel for it. So when I draw this line here, this I said is a very significant line because this means falling into separation from connectivity. This line means falling into separation. So whatever is going on in the integral space, and again, think of the infinite logosophia, the male-female connected, and every PowerPoint in this, we are each a PowerPoint in this space. And the I that we have, I'm building up to now showing that in the ego lens, in the ego space, then when we make ourselves here in this space of predication, when we make ourselves a single bracket object and make others and our world and nature an object, this is where the trouble is. Because when we objectify nature, we treat it like dirt. When you look at nature, it is sacred. So it makes all the difference in the world where we are placing the points. And my students would ask me when I started teaching this 20 years ago to get the beginnings of these two languages and to say we must develop literacy here as well and listen to our great texts. And they would say, Professor Gangadine, I can understand what you're saying about the I am, but that's too far away. If the journey of an awakened person is to break out of the ego lens wherever I am and go into the I am, that's too far away. And then I began to see, this is how slow I am. It took me 10 years to make another move that just caused them to breathe deeply with relief. Because it's clear that the Logos, I hope you can see this. This is not very dark, this pen. That's in a way where I wanted you to come closer, but follow these marks now. This is very important. The Logos. The Logos. When I say Logos, I mean Logosophia. It's always the male, full, infinite male-female. This space, because it's the infinite word, it completely surrounds us all at all times. We're never outside of the Logos. This should start making you feel a lot. Because the journey from here to there ain't as far as it appears to be. Because if you had to write your name, write it something like this. I, whatever it is, but realize that you are always surrounded already in your high self. Your self, your high self, your integral self, your Logos self is always with you, whatever lens you're using for whatever culture or construction or narrative you have about yourself. Whatever predicated and impredicated story you have that might be indicated with that, you're always already situated and surrounded by your high self. And the journey from here to there is, in a way, the letting go, of daring to let go of the attachment to the identity structure that you have, the infrastructure, the tacit infrastructure that you have bought into so deeply that is a pre-conscious place of your worldview. To have the courage to step back from that, which is what we're talking about, sacred dialogue here, requires the capacity to suspend the rigid stories, and often multiple stories that we have about ourselves, and to find that you're already there. So that this is the powerful force that embraces and holds us, that we're always being held in the Logos. All of us, all through the centuries, all through creation, and right now. So as abysmal as the story may look, as many of our speakers around the table said, I may be showing that there's a terrible clash of civilization and climate heating and a dismal prospect for the planet at this point. But at the same time, there's reason for hope. Because the most powerful, overwhelming force that's orchestrating this entire evolutionary drama is holding us already. So the journey from here to there, from the self to the self, is stepping back and getting out of the way to discover yourself already there. And then when you do that, you are in your PowerPoint. And that is a sacred space. And each of us holds this enormous power. Gandhi knew it. We use Gandhi as an example. Gandhi was practicing the Gita and the Gospels. And he understood satyagraha. Satya is truth. Graha is force, it's physics. And he saw he could bring it down into the political situation and confront any regime. And that the power of tapping this space brought here will move any regime. That's another global formula of indigenous wisdom. One point in the infinite field, because it's attached to the infinite, is fractal. It's holistic. It expresses the infinite, and each of us is such a PowerPoint. So when you begin to touch your I am, you are tapping a boundless power that can manifest in the world, where all the violence and fragmentation, polarization, alienation, 9/11s, genocides are taking place. So that Gandhi, in his example, saw that this power will stand up to anything. That's the power of one. It is also the power of many, because when many individuals, us, the global citizens, who are beginning to see that it's vital now to help culture move from this dangerous place into our heritage. There's a cultural way to make yourself here and make culture here, and economics and ecology and economy in this culture that we've been taught. And I was amazed around the table when I heard so many voices speaking to me from this space. I listen, is it single bracket talk or is it this talk? And when I hear that, water is sacred, it's not a commodity, it's not a product, something you buy. That nature has a language. Nature here is sacred. It's the body of Om, it's the body of Logos, it's the body of the infinite, of infinite spirit. There's not a split between spirit and matter. There's not a split between economics and ecology. The ecology is the infinite field of interconnectivity that's always with us. And the eikos, the economy, ekos nomos, and I use the word logonomics. If we could practice economic reality in the not the egonomics, perhaps we'll find profound wealth that each of us already has in the commonwealth of this place, the abundance. There's a culture and politics of abundance when we live here. And the poverty that one might have here, and that's the point of what someone referred to the Tibetans who are looking for the minuscule way of minimizing the use of resources. Well, if you can tap the resources here in this PowerPoint, there's boundless wealth in this place. So that imagine oil and water that are in some kind of tension here and all of the different polarities. I'm going to start winding up because I think with this group here, you know this already. I'm just kind of opening up a space for us to dialogue further about it. I'm just trying to collect the many brilliant things I heard over and over. What I did not have time to do is, and we could do this in the continuation of our dialogue exchange, is why is it that this place, however you shape it, would lead to many different worldviews, That's one point I'd like to develop. Right? I'm suggesting that you could be a Christian here. You could be a scientist here. You can be a materialist, a spiritualist. All of these isms we could have in the ego lens and technology. And all of the worldviews have been developed here. So materialism is just an organization of our predication life that says matter is the deepest organizing space in our mental ecology. Idealism is an opposite one that says, no, in the beginning is spirit. Spirit organizes all of our predications. There are different ways of organizing the predication programs. So idealism is the ontology or worldview that organizes our predications to say, this is how you predicate. Spirit is first. Spirit is everywhere. So when you go out to the villages of the Bakongo culture in Africa and you see them decorating the stone and putting flowers, and the anthropologist from Europe is there and say, what is this? This is spirit. Well, that sounds like a complete mispredication to the European scientist. Stones can't be spirit. They're dead stuff. That's a different worldview. So when you speak the materialist language, the one that says that in the beginning is a Big Bang, that's a different grammar than the biblical one that says in the beginning is spirit. So is it Genesis or Big Bang? That's a division of two worlds. And so all of the different worlds can be formed: dualism, materialism, monism, pluralism. You could give all the different lenses and be right in the space. And I use the word ego-mentalism for this. When you are in the ego-mental program, whatever your worldview, you are, I don't use the word fundamentalist, I said ego-mental. And what is obvious, and it came out this morning again, science, as glorious as it is still using the ego-mental predication lens. And we try to diagnose it, and we call it materialism, scientific materialism. I think that's a misnomer. Because you could be a spiritualist and still in the ego lens, and someone this morning said that even spiritualism and spirituality is driven by the market. That is not the same as spirituality, which is to experience one's direct interconnectivity with all reality. And genuine deep science, and this has been coming out in the SEED conversations, a great thrill to see it with indigenous wisdom and science, that genuine science is not ego-mental. Genuine science is attempting to open the lens to understand the interconnectivity of nature. So the butterfly effect is a higher kind of causation, double bracket causation. Holistic thinking, holistic causation is the vast, unimaginable, unthinkable interconnectivity causally of all things. So to grasp for the butterfly effect is to see that it's not a causal, single bracket, linear causation of X causes Y causes Z. So the butterfly effect requires this calculus. And if nature is profoundly interconnectivity, then of course the movement of the butterfly's wings in the rainforest of Brazil is connected with the tsunami in the Pacific. That's a no-brainer here. So that when you begin to see non-locality in nature, and the most advanced frontier physics is beginning to get the tools to tap this kind of conceptuality. Concepts completely shift when you take them from their broken place into their integral place. All of the concepts. Causation here, brought here, becomes an incredible intercausal link of interconnectivity. Perform that experiment with time. Ego time, single bracket time, is deadly. Native wisdom knows that because it breaks up into past, present, and future. It breaks everything. Because when you give it identity tag, you put it in its own place. You separate it. So ego time is broken between past, present, and future. Whereas integral time, time here, again. And we talked about that this morning. Imagine entering into a moment of now, here, now power, where every moment touches every other moment in the now. That is holistic time. And it cannot be processed by the ego mind. The mind has to go into the space, since it's power space where the I and the other connect. This is a deep place of epistemology. The place of knowing, the place of intimacy, and the place of compassion and moral consciousness is here. Because as long as you're in here, morality breaks down because you objectify the other. The I, it. The other is an it. The other person, your spouse, your lover, the other culture, the other way of thinking is always an object, an it. To cross into this space is a space of deep dialogue, and it comes again with a great price. You've got to open up to stand in this space and be open to let the other speak her voice in a nonviolent way where you meet. So this reverse arrow is an I-thou place where whatever its nature or the other culture, or the other person, whomever, you encounter your other in the open space. And that means you can't lay your agenda and your lens and tacit structure on the other. That's violence. So the pathway into moral consciousness, and all of our teachers are teaching, Gandhi, Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, this is moral consciousness when you find the place of compassion and deep dialogue and nonviolence in encountering the other as a sacred being and allowing her to speak in her terms and listening to that. You can't listen here because you're listening with your single bracket ears. And to listen in this deep sense as a scientist to what nature is saying. So good science, the next frontier in the movement of scientific revolution, is to finally break the ego-mental barrier, because ego-mentalism downloads the phenomena into an objectified package. And everything in our culture now, the exciting thing about our culture, we all know this, and it came out this morning, we're on the edge of bursting into this place to become human together. Because when we're in this space, that's what compassion is. So when Jesus said, when I was in prison, you visited me, and when I was hungry, you fed me. And the disciples are still here. They say, when did we do this, Lord? When you tended to the least of mine, you tended to me. It's just this point. You are the other. The other is in you. You cannot sever yourself from the other. When you recognize the other in you, then you recognize interconnectivity, and it takes a quantum shift in consciousness to go from this calculus of othering the object to othering a subject, a sacred being. So imagine raising our children here in education as sacred beings. I've raised 5 children, and it was a real struggle to keep them alive through the culture and the schools. And they would come home shut down every day, one after the other, and I would have to sit with them and try to hold the space and help them to breathe. So our education system here of putting our children in this space of culture, to saddle them with a single bracket stories, is a profound kind of violence. It's an abuse of our kids. I think we have to see it and say it. By living in the ego-mental space, we're violating ourselves, others, our children, nature, and we don't know the meaning of sacred space. To be in the sacred space where nature is sacred, where ecology and economy, imagine money is sacred. Money, logos money, has currency and fluidity if we know how to use it. But you can't be competent in the use of sacred money if you're here. Lynn Twist knows that. How do you fundraise here? The story we heard this morning of the kids, give it all away and you'll see. Well, they understand logonomics. They understand abundance. So when you put yourself here, you are impoverished, you are in poverty. But when you find yourself here, there's no end of wealth that you have in being who you are. So think about time then, think about space. And what happens to all of our broken words here, space, time, cause, substance, figure, motion, texture, color. All of these words, when you move them into the grammar of the original language of nature, a miracle happens. Because if you could touch space, you will find that it's space-time. It's a continuum. Every category and concept touches every other as a cosine. And when you begin to decode it in the double bracket space, you begin to learn the depth of those words. So if you took water and placed it here, it becomes sacred water. It flows through all. And I think we shouldn't demote oil and keep oil down here. because the egonomic culture has given oil a bad name, right? And oil is sacred too. So that I hope I'm giving you enough sense of what it would take across from one to the other. And you must have all kinds of questions. I hope to provoke you, and I'd love to talk more about the different worldviews we have here. And I want to end on this note, that we are not educated to understand that we are living in worldviews, and that worldviews are powerful systems like DNA structures of predication of worlds. What makes sense and is thinkable in one worldview cannot be thought and spoken in another. And therefore we can't dialogue between them. If one person is speaking an idealist grammar and sees spirit everywhere, and another one is speaking a materialist language that sees it all as matter, and consciousness comes from matter and not from an intelligent source, they're in different worlds. They're worlds apart. Their words are different. So words are broken in different meaning across the many boundless different worldviews we have, and we don't know how to connect them. To connect them, you have to go back deep into the Logos, where all words and worldviews and perspectives and disciplines originate. And many of us live in multiple lenses and don't even realize we have multiple identities. For example, I may be a believing Christian and I speak the Bible language and I know that God created the universe. This is one I, the believing Christian. I'm also a scientist. I'm pretty advanced and I believe that the Big Bang is true. And I speak the language of physics. That's another I. That language is different from my biblical language. I'm also a civic American and I believe in democracy and sacred civic space, and I believe in keeping my religion out of the politics. And that's a big ouch for me because my religion is saying every moment breathe and live your spirituality. So this third identity of being a civic American is causing me a lot of distress because I don't even know these three different I's of me are not connected. So I'm seeing my therapist here. She's a Jungian, not Freudian. And so she's telling me that I have an anima and an animus, a male and a female. And if I don't get them together, it's bad news for me. So now, oy vey, I've got a male and a female to deal with. And I've got that that's causing me some real distress. But I happen to know this tree-hugging friend who teaches yoga. So I've been chanting Om and doing yoga. It's ego yoga, but never mind. I'm breathing and feeling well and getting in shape, and I'm doing my yoga. And I know it's not helping me because when I chant Om, my friends are stepping away from me. That's still another world. But fortunately, another friend is practicing Feng Shui, and I really am moving my furniture around and getting my whole organization. And we don't know how to get those worlds together. So I'm broken into pieces. There's no inner dialogue. And if I'm broken into multiple identities, it's normal schizophrenia. What the hell? Let it be. It's all right. But if I don't have that inner dialogue, I'm not whole. And if a person is broken inside, the world is going to be broken. So if we're going to heal the world, we have to heal ourselves. And that's a local point about indigenous locale. And if we can't heal ourselves with deep dialogue inside and between one another, we're going to remain in a deadly broken culture. So that to sum this up, it seems to me that the exciting moment we are together on this planet is that can we together finally grow up and leave the adolescent ways, the destructive ways of ego-mental mind processing, and consciously take responsibility for crossing into the space of integrity and connectivity. So when Alan said that holistic thinking is a totally different way of thinking than ego, he didn't use these words, but I'm paraphrasing in my way, that I agree. This has dominated us for millennia and continues to dominate us now. And each of us as a global citizen crossing into this place has to take personal responsibility for mental hygiene. How am I using my mind? Am I egoing? But if you are, you're part of the problem. Don't blame Bush for your problem. If you're egoing, you're participating in perpetuating a regime of thinking that is generating the deep crises we have at the personal level, interpersonal level, 9/11s, and the devastation of our ecology and our economy. And there is an alternative. I'll just stop on that point.
Ashok Gangadee, thank you. Thanks very much. We don't really have time for questions. I don't know. We got 10. Okay. We just have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm sorry, I know that the energy in this room, we could go for another hour easily, and then some. But bring them on.
I would love to hear some
if someone has
reactions,
a thought.
questions.
Okay, let's see this gentleman.
I just have it's a paradox, and I'm going to use a novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez called 100 Years of Solitude. And in a sense, what he argues is that the journey from what you call the culture of arrogance and the economy of arrogance to a culture and economy of humility is overshadowed. That is to say that magic can't take you there. Magic can't take you there. That the language of institutions, evolving as they are, provide a global constraint. So that people labor tirelessly and endlessly in magic. And what I'm afraid of is that that this model is in terms of philosophical idealism, that's too idealistic and not enough talk about the language of institutions. And I mean global institutions like World Bank and IMF and WTO and so on, that's providing so much immiseration in the world. Anyway, could you address that?
Yes, a great question, and I'd be glad to. I am working with world leaders, Irvin Laszlo and others, to form a World Wisdom Council, which we've done in the last 4 years. In the last 10 years, my institute, Global Dialogue Institute, where global dialogue is the dialogue that awakens global consciousness. So although this may look kind of mystical and far removed and idealistic, it's not idealism, but it may look idealistic, right? The World Wisdom Council, people like Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, and others working, all recognize that we have to shift our way of thinking and being if we're going to survive. And we have to do it institutionally and individually. So that is exactly what you say is exactly right. Can education be shifted from education in the box to integral education and